and I welcome you to the second week of Angular development course. In this week, we will be focusing on the introduction to the Angular framework and its architecture. And also, by the end of this week, you will be creating a simple Angular project using the Angular CLI and also explore the various Angular CLI commands as well. So let's dive into this first session. Before proceeding further, let's recap what we learned in the last week. So, in the last week, we learned about the introduction of this course. We understood what are the things that we are going to learn, and also we understood what are the prerequisites for taking this course, mainly in terms of knowing the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, along with a few other terminologies like APIs and how the browser works, so on and so forth. We also kind of explored what are the various types of applications that are available, which can be developed, and what are the various developers or the stacks on which you can work. We understood what are the various career options possible, and also we understood like what is Angular. Like we just try to understand what is the basic idea of why we require Angular, and also we got to know a bit about TypeScript as well. So with all this done last week, let's now dive into this week's content. In this session, we'll try to understand what are the various features of Angular. We also will try to understand what is the history of Angular starting right from AngularJS till the current version. Then we would go ahead and understand what is the architecture and basic building blocks of Angular. And then we would understand how can you think in Angular. What I mean by that is if you see a web application blueprint or a design, how can you break down it in terms of Angular architecture mentally, right? Then we would go ahead and create a basic Angular application. And further, I would also be explaining to you what are the project structure best practices which you can follow. This is mainly from your interview perspective and also from your real world project experience as well. So let's proceed. So the learning objectives of this week is as follows. First, we'll try to understand why Angular is beneficial in implementing your next web application. Then we'd understand what is Angular architecture, its features, and the basic building blocks of Angular. Then we would understand how to decompose any web application wireframe into basic Angular architecture. So a wireframe over here means just the basic mock design or the blueprint which you will be receiving from the UX team, and which just contains the basic building blocks of what your website looks like. And depending on that, we will try to understand how can we mentally break it down into the individual Angular components, right? Next, we will try to understand how can we install Angular and create our first Angular application. And now finally, we will try to understand how to structure the Angular project in a better way. And along the way, I would also be kind of discussing with you what are the best practices, what are the common pitfalls, and what are the interview questions which are expected. So first, let's try to understand what is Angular and what are the features of Angular. So as we discussed earlier in the last session, if you remember, Angular is basically following the MVVM pattern, which is the model view model pattern. And due to that, it also allows us to have two-way data binding between the model and view. So if you remember from a previous session, we understood that when you have the model view model architecture, you basically decouple your model, which is your data, and your view, which is nothing but the UI HTML that you show to the user. And the two-way data binding over here means that any changes to the model dynamically updates the view, and any changes to the view dynamically updates the model. I will show you a real-time example of this just in a few minutes, but just stay on with me for now. The next, Angular uses declarative UI, which means that it uses HTML actually to write the UI instead of the JS. What I mean by that is there are a few frameworks which instead of using the HTML uses JavaScript to build your UI or the front end part of your application, but Angular is more flexible where you can actually define your UI directly by using HTML. And Angular, the other advantage of Angular is it provides you more optimization and features over the time. Which what I mean by that is Angular is updated twice every year. Like there is a new version of Angular which is released twice every year. And with every new version release, there are significant improvement both to the Angular's optimization, like in terms of the performance, and also there are newer features are added regularly with each updates. Next, Angular also gives you opportunity to easily implement PWA, which is progressive web app. If you remember from our first week discussion, there are two concepts. One is the progressive web app and single page application. So progressive web app means that you can create a web application which kind of mimics the native application and runs from your browser directly, wherein you can add offline features, you can cache a few requests, so on and so forth. So those can be done easily using Angular. And also you can implement single page application as well. So single page application means that you give the user a feeling that they are being in the same page, though you are kind of internally navigating them between multiple views. And one more feature of Angular is that both web and mobile app can be had in a single code base. So if you remember, we talked about a hybrid web application model wherein you can have the same code base and deploy it both for the web browser and also for your native applications like iOS and Android. So when you use Angular, you can do this easily using the single code base. There is a framework called as Ionic, which uses Angular. So if you use Ionic, which also follows the same syntax like Angular, you can use your same Angular code, but you can ship it both for Android and iOS as well. And finally, Angular is maintained by Google and has a good community support. So what I mean by that is, if you remember, I told that Angular is an open source project. So the owners of that project is the Google team, the core Google team. So since it's being maintained by Google, there are periodic optimizations and feature updates, which I told you earlier. And also there's a good community support. What I mean by community support is there are a good number of developers who are actively using Angular and also kind of adding more features to the Angular. And also there is a lot of discussion around various features and issues about Angular, which you can see over a website called stackoverflow.com. So if you're not aware, stackoverflow.com is a website where the developers kind of ask any of their project or real-time issues or queries that they have, and the other developers or users answer that query, right? So Angular has a good discussion threads happening in the Stack Overflow and other similar forums as well. So that's what I mean that it has a good community support. And also Angular, as we discussed earlier, provides us the complete framework solution for building the application that are scalable, performance oriented. It is accessible, fast, testable, and is cross-platform. So what we mean by each of these terms? So first is scalable. So what do I mean by scalable? So just understand it in a simple way, right? So say assume you are building a website, say a flipkart.com or amazon.com. And at the starting, you don't really have that many departments. Maybe if you remember the history of amazon.com, they just started with books, right? Initially, they just had books and slowly they kept on adding one department. So just imagine that you're going to do the same thing. So initially you are going to build one website which is going to have one department or one page. And over the time you're going to keep on adding multiple pages or departments or sections to your website, which will keep on adding to the size of the application. But even if you keep on adding to the size of the application, there should not be any impact to the performance of the application, right? So that is called something called scalable. So how Angular helps you to achieve that is something we'll be seeing down the line. But just understand this word scalable because it's one of the important interview questions as well. They may ask you what are the features of Angular, and you can say that it is scalable, it is performance oriented, accessible, fast, testable, and is cross-platform. So I hope by now you would have understood what is scalable means like. So the next is we understand that it's also performance oriented. So what I mean by performance oriented is that whenever Angular, you develop any application with Angular and you follow the best practices, Angular maintains a very small footprint in terms of the web application. Also, the rendering of the Angular is quite fast, provided you follow certain best practices. So due to that, even if you have any applications which are going to be used by thousands of users, or you have an application that has tons of feature, Angular still performs well in those kind of scenarios as well. Next is the point of accessible. What I mean by accessible is there is something called as web accessibility. So if you guys are not aware of what is web accessibility, so we as normal users, right? Most of us as normal users, we are able to see our monitors, we are able to use the mouse, we are able to type fast, and we are able to distinguish even if there is some minor differences in the colors of the screen, right? But there are a bunch of people out there who are not able to do it. For example, I may be a user who is not able to see at all, or I may be a user who has some tremors in my hand and I know I'm not able to use mouse properly. So for those kind of users, we provide them additional features, or we still kind of make our application accessible to them, right? So what we do is, in case the user is not able to see properly or is not able to see at all, so in those kind of scenarios, what they do is these users use something called as screen readers. There are a lot of screen reader solutions available in market. A few are kind of built in your operating system itself. So if you are using Windows, you have something called Microsoft Narrator, or also you can install a lot of plugins or third-party applications like JAWS, JAWS, which kind of gives you the screen reading capabilities. So what happens is when the user opens our application using one of these screen readers, still our we should code our application in such a way that the user is able to understand in which screen they are, what is the current button they have highlighted, and those kind of things. So that is what we mean by accessible. Next is fast. As I said, it's also closely related with your performance. So, like you are Angular. If you structure your code in a proper way and follow the best practices, you would be able to create your application which is quite fast and does not lag much, right? The next is testable. What I mean by testable is there are two aspects of testing which we should understand over here. One is the unit testing, and one other is the end-to-end testing. So what I mean by unit testing is, say assume I'll just give you a simple example. You have developed a web application, say maybe like Amazon.com or Flipkart.com or any of that site, right? irctc.co.in or any of those sites. If you just mentally break down all these sites, end of the day, what these sites are nothing but just a bunch of functions or a bunch of features which are implemented in a web page, right? Say for example, if I go to the login page of Amazon.com, so what at end of the day are the functions which are written in the JavaScript are nothing but a function which will kind of validate if you have entered the user ID and password. And there'll be another function which probably would be doing your login method, right? So which will be making a API call to the backend, validate whether whatever you have entered is correct, and if it is correct, maybe return your token and all that kind of thing, right? So when I say a unit testing, what it means is you'll be writing unit test cases. So what is a unit test case is nothing but you would just kind of write a test, like a mock test over whatever code you have written in such a way that you will pass it a mock data, and you'll see whether that particular function which you have written is returning you the correct data or not. So a simple example would be, say you have written a function which sums two number, right? You have written a function, say sum, you pass it to argument a and b, and you just return the value as a plus b. So if I have to write the unit test case for this, all I need to do is I just need to call this sum with say some two random numbers, say 1 and 2. And I would expect that, this sum of 1 and 2 returns me 3. So what is the advantage of this is, say you have a very large application and there are tons of developers working. If you know, like in a very large project, there are people working across the continents, across geographies, across shifts, so on and so forth. You don't want someone else to kind of break your code accidentally, or even yourself breaking your code accidentally just because you're doing some changes in the future. So just to detect those kind of logical errors or logical changes, we use unit testing. Don't worry, I've just given you a high level update right now. So in the future, there is a full-fledged course or a full-fledged week on which we'll be talking just about unit testing, right? And the other testing which we is the end-to-end testing. What it means is unit testing is not generally following what the user will do. It just is concerned about the business features or the particular functionality which you have implemented. Whereas on the end-to-end testing, what we do is we actually mimic what a user will do on the screen. So say for example, the user comes, he or she clicks on the login button, then they go and click on the user name button, they type something, then they go and click on password button, they password field, and they type something, and then they go and click on the login button, then they see the the home page. In the home page, they click on something. So all this actual user usage scenario, right, is what something we mock in the end-to-end testing, and we compare it with what is the expected result. So where this end-to-end testing is normally used is, say whenever you have to deploy your application to production, or you have made a major change, and whenever there's a major release happening. So at that point of time, instead of sitting and manually testing your application, people usually in the production scenario, they will first run the unit test cases just to ensure all the logical things are working fine. And secondly, they will execute this end-to-end testing just to ensure even the UI or the visual aspects of it are working fine as expected. Okay. So as I said, don't worry if you don't understand it right now. Down the course, we have a section dedicated for this, right? And second is the last point is the point of cross-platform. So what I mean by cross-platform is Angular can run across any operating system. As I said before, Angular just requires a browser to run. So it doesn't matter which operating system your browser is currently running. It can run on Windows, it can run on Android, it can run on Windows, like your Mac OS. You can also package it as a native application and deploy it on, install it on iOS, Android, so on and so forth. The next, as we talked about the two-way data binding and the MVVM architecture, right? So the major advantage of this is you don't really need to write a ton of code just to achieve the two-way data binding, right? And since it uses the model view model architecture, we have decoupled the model and the view, and the view model takes care of kind of updating the data in the backend, and it kind of makes your work quite easier. I will show you a sample demo of what I mean. The next part is Angular also gives you something called as Angular material and CDK for styling. So what it means is, if you guys have worked a bit on HTML, CSS, JavaScript before, you would know that if you have to style something on HTML, it's not a very easy job. You have to write a ton of CSS classes, you have to write a ton of JavaScript events, and there are a lot of things that happens in order to make your application visually appealing. What Angular has done is, instead of you making you sit and write all this code by yourself, or use a third party library like Bootstrap or Material UI or any of those kind of third party styling frameworks, Angular has provided something called Angular Material inbuilt, which you can use to kind of write your own styles, or use the built-in components on which you can customize based on what you require and build your project. So the advantage of it is you don't really require too many of the third-party libraries to depend on. And similarly, Component Development Kit or CDK is an additional feature which is provided by Angular, which provides a few of the, I would say, extra functionalities. Like, say, you want a feature to copy to the clipboard. I hope you guys know, there are a few websites which provides you an option to copy the text to the clipboard, right? You just click on that icon and it copies whatever is in the box to your clipboard, which you can paste in any of the other application. Or maybe you have to implement a feature, something like drag and drop, you have two boxes and you want to drag something from one box to other box, those kind of advanced features is what is provided by CDK. Again, don't worry, down the line we have a dedicated week just for Angular material and CDK, which and we will be seeing all this in detail. The second last point is we have something called dependency injection and modular code provided by Angular. Since it uses the MVVM architecture, Angular provides you a very modular code, means you can divide your applications into multiple modules, and again inside the modules you can divide your application into components, services, pipes, so on and so forth. So it really makes your application quite modular. As we would be building the project down the line, you would see this in action. And dependency injection is nothing but it's just a software architecture pattern, wherein instead of importing the entire class and writing the entire functionality again and again, we kind of what we do is we write a common reusable service, which is called in Angular terms, which has your common reusable function or variable or whatever you want to say. And that single service, or the feature that you write, can be imported across any of the components as a dependency injection. So don't worry if you don't get it. Down the line, we will be seeing each of these in detail. And last but not the least, Angular provides you something called CLI, which is nothing but command line interface for performing various common tasks. What I mean by common tasks is, say, if you want to create a new project, you want to add a new component to your existing project, or you want to kind of update your current Angular version to the new latest version, you want to deploy or build your Angular code. So all these kind of common tasks, for these common tasks, you get built-in commands from the Angular CLI, which is the advantage of using Angular CLI. So I hope with all this, you are now fairly clear on why we require Angular, or rather what are the features of Angular. Don't worry if you don't really understand most of these terms. I'll just try to summarize it over here. Down the line, as we go further deep into the course, we'll be seeing all of these in action, right? History of Angular and understand how Angular has evolved over the time, right from the first version, which is AngularJS, to the current version of Angular 30, and even we'll understand how the future versions would be like. So to understand the history of Angular, we need to understand that the first Angular version was released way back in 2010, and it was called as AngularJS. Okay, and it used plain JavaScript to write web application. And one more information for you is AngularJS was predominantly following the MVC pattern, which is Model View Controller pattern. So in that, the architecture was using controller for updating the data, and hence we had to still write a ton of code. But compared to what was the technology available back in 2010, it was well appreciated and well received by developers, and there was a lot of strong traction for AngularJS. Then the Google team, what they did is back in 2016, they rewrote the entire AngularJS from the scratch. And that's when the AngularJS project got renamed to Angular, because they didn't want, to attach any version name, or they didn't want to attach any other suffix to it. So they just called AngularJS as Angular going forward from 2016. And from version 2, Angular was just called as Angular, right? And always remember that, this is also a favorite interview question, that do you know what is the difference between AngularJS and Angular? So if you are asked such kind of question, all you need to say is AngularJS was the first version of Angular which was introduced back in 2010. It followed the MVC pattern of architecture which we discussed earlier. And Angular 2, or Angular as it is called, is the rewritten version of Angular. It is predominantly built on TypeScript and has all the features which we just described, right? One interesting fact which you need to know is there was no Angular 3 version ever released, right? Because there was a mismatching package versioning between Angular router and the core modules. So what we mean by this, just give me a couple of minutes, I will show you in action. But for now, just remember the fact that Angular didn't have any version called 3. So this also might be asked to you, are you aware? Is there any version of Angular which was not released? These are just kind of fun questions which you might encounter sometimes in your interviews as well. So going ahead, Angular 4 was then updated and released in December 2016. And after December 2016, Angular has been frequently updated with a new version being released every 6 months. So usually what happens is in January, the one version is released, then again in June, July, the next version is released. And as of January 2021, Angular 13 was released and is the latest stable version. And the work on Angular 13.2 is underway. So what happens is with every new release, Angular adds new features to the framework and also optimizes the current features and functionalities to make it perform better. So whenever you get a chance or you're working in a project and a new version of Angular is being released, it is better that you talk to your lead or your architect in your project and try to ensure that your project is also slowly getting updated to the latest stable version of Angular being released, to ensure that you get all the latest and the greatest features of Angular. And another important interview related question which might be asked to you is, from Angular 9, there is something called as Angular IV feature, which is the default compiler and renderer for Angular. And it has been the default compiler and renderer from version 9. So, and with IV being released, it has significantly improved the performance of Angular by using something called as tree shaking. So I'll just give you a perspective, right? Whenever your application is being compiled, or your application is being deployed into the production server. So what happens essentially is that all your code that you have written, the compiler, or the build tool that is being used for doing all this process, it will just combine all of them into a bunch of files, and those bunch of files will then get deployed, or transferred to the web server on which it is being hosted, and gets transferred to your browser. So what used to happen before Angular 9 is that tree shaking still happens, but before Angular 9, since we were using an older version of renderer, this was not optimized. And that is the reason why, a lot of debate you would see earlier, why React is better than Angular is because the performance is slow. So a majority of reason was due to that. It is from the pre-IV days. So after IV was released, there was a significant improvement to the performance and using tree shaking. So what tree shaking means is, when Angular is building your application, or you are getting your application ready for deployment, Angular will first check your entire code base and try to understand what are the features or what are the only things that is currently being used by the application, and rest of the other features which you have imported in your application but not used anywhere, those kind of features will get removed during the build process. So that is called as tree shaking. Don't worry if you don't understand, just in a minute we will be seeing it in action. Then also you need to understand that, as I said before, if there is a new version of Angular getting released, it is better that you upgrade it to the latest version, right? So to do that, there is something called as a website called as update.angular.io, which is their official version, wherein you can input what is your current Angular version, what is the version you wish to upgrade, and automatically the Angular team would give you the recommendations or suggestions which you need to follow to upgrade your application. We'll be seeing that in a minute. So now let's jump in and try to understand this in action. Okay. So first, before we dive in any deeper, I promised you guys that I would be showing you what is two-way data binding. So let's just try to understand quickly using a simple demo application that I have. And before I jump in any further, I just want to give you guys a heads up on an interesting utility that we have, which we can use to try a number of web applications without installing anything in our local. There is a website called as stackblitz.com. And what is the advantage of using stackblitz.com is you don't really need to install any of the Node.js, Angular CLI or any of those packages in your local computer, but rather what you can do is just open this, and just the way you code it in your local machine, you can do the same thing directly from the browser itself, without having to install or configure anything in your local machine. So what I've done for a quick demo of Angular to you guys is just to show what two-way data binding means. I've just put up a simple project. Don't worry about the code. I just want you to understand what two-way data binding means, right? So as you guys know, this is my view. The thing that you see on the right is what nothing but the application that I have, and the fields that you see over here are my form controls, and what you see over here is nothing but my data or the model, right? So say something like, I have a field over here, and this is whatever I type over here will get updated in my model, right? And also whatever is in my model, also comes into my view. So let's try to see in action. So say I have something called skill link over here, which is being updated over here, and I don't have anything in my job. That's why you see my job is blank right now. But if I update the skill link to say something just like SL, you see that automatically my model is getting updated. And similarly, if I type something over job like say NG or Angular, you'd see that automatically my data is getting updated, right? This is one way of it. The other way around also, say assume instead of skill link, like the default value, I just pass something, say SL here. You'd see that automatically both my model is updated and also my value in the view is updated. So this is called as dynamic two-way data binding, which means that any changes on your view will also update your model, and any update changes to your model will also update the view. And why I say Angular is a better option to do it, I'll just give you an example. So say now I want to implement this two-way data binding. If I have to use Angular, all I need to do is I have to just use this simple attribute over here called ng model and just pass whatever is the object value over here, right? And that's it. Angular will take care of all the two-way data binding for you automatically in the background. But it's the same thing you have to do using say a traditional HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And if you know a bit of JavaScript, you know that you have to write a ton of code just to achieve the same thing. I'm not telling it's not possible to achieve using just JavaScript alone, but if you start writing the code for it, you will understand that you just need to write some 200, 300 lines of code just to achieve this feature. Whereas the same thing can just be done in just one line using Angular. So that is the main advantage of using any frameworks or libraries. It really reduces you a ton of code. And this is the benefit of two-way data binding. Any change that happens to your data, which is data over here or the user model over here, automatically that updates in your screen. And similarly, if the user changes something in the view, automatically it also updates the model over here. So a simple example would be you have something like a stock ticker or your flight or railway departure schedule. So any changes that happens in the data automatically comes on your view or the UI. And similarly, if user changes something on the UI, automatically that gets updated in your data. So with that being said, I'm clear now, you would have understood what two-way data binding means, right? Next, I also promised you guys that I would be telling you why Angular version 3 was not released, right? And for that, I need you to understand that Angular as a framework is not just one file or one component. Internally, Angular is a bunch of dependencies or libraries which or tools which it uses to implement it. So as you can see over here, don't worry what all this means. Just in a minute we'll be also understanding how the Angular project structure looks and what are the each things, but just stay with me for now, right? So if you see over here, I'm just currently running a dummy project which uses Angular version 6. How I know that it is Angular version 6 is, if you can see over here, whatever libraries I've installed for Angular, all of them are pointing to version 6. So that's how I'm saying it is using version 6, right? So if you see over here, Angular has a ton of libraries internally using. So you have something called Angular Core, Angular Forms, Angular Common, Router, Compiler, and all these things, right? So what happened in Angular, when the Angular version 2 was released, Angular team, when they were constantly upgrading their versions, what they did was they had a mismatch over here. So what happened is they had the core as version 2, but the router they constantly improved and made it to version 3, right? So when the next major version had to be released, unfortunately they could not keep everything in the same standard, because the router had been updated to a latest version, and due to that they could not have the core pointing to 3 and also update everything else to 3. So just to avoid that mismatch, they skipped version 3, and after from version 4 everything was properly following the uniform standard of having the same version. Like all the angular libraries or components which are following that particular version will have that same version, major version number in that particular version. Okay, so that's the reason why Angular version 3 was never released. I hope that is clear to you as well. And with that being said, next we'll try to understand how can you upgrade any Angular version between each other, right? So for that, I will take you to a website called update.angular.io. Okay. So as you can see over here, this is the official Angular upgrade guide. So what you can do over here is, say, assume I am using some version of Angular, say maybe I'm using version 2, which is a very old version. And I decided that, hey, I have to use the latest version of Angular, which says version 14. And if you choose a version which is not yet released, it will give you a kind of a warning or a thing that that version is either unstable, or if you are also switching between versions which are like more than two releases, say from 2, if you're directly version upgrading to 14, it will give you a warning that it is not really advisable to directly switch to the greater version without going incrementally in between. So ideally the plan is, I'll just show you to you in action. So say you have any version already installed in your application. For example, if I have version 2 installed, and say the latest version which I have in market is now version 30. So what is expected is, first I have to incrementally upgrade this version 2 to 4, then 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, then 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, and then finally I will be able to upgrade it to 30. Right? So this is the Angular versions that we have right now. And why we have it in this fashion is because every version incrementally adds whatever was done in the previous version. So if you try to directly upgrade Angular 2 to Angular 13, you will run into a lot of issues, because over the time there will be a lot of classes which have been deprecated, a lot of new classes added, a lot of new features added and removed, so on and so forth. So always remember that when you are upgrading your Angular, you have to do it sequentially. So when you start, say, assume you are in version 7 right now, and you decided that your architect or your manager told you that okay, now you have to get into the latest version, which is Angular 13. So what you need to basically do is you have to incrementally upgrade your application from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 12 to 30, right? And once you come to version 13, then upgrading to the future versions like 14, 15, and so on and so forth, there won't be much of a major rewrite of the application. Say, suppose you are on version 4 and you decide to jump into version 10 or 11, then expect some major rewrite of your code, because over the time, as I said, there will be some major breaking changes added, for which you might have to refactor your code a bit or to make it work. But most of the time, if your code is up to date and a major version is released, you don't really need to do a major rewrite of your code as well. And also another major advantage of using update.angular is, most of these if there are any minor rewrites or minor changes in the code which needs to be done, but simply by running these commands, those conversions also happen out of the box. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just hypothetically take that we have Angular version which is in say version 12, and we decided to upgrade it to version 30. So the next thing that the Angular application will ask you is, what is the complexity of the application, basic, medium, or advanced? So what is the meaning of that is, basic is like any application which is just like a single page, or just has 2 or 3 pages, and that's not much of functionality involved. Say maybe you can say just like something as simple as a login page, and you just show user some landing page, or your page is just static and you just show some hi hello kind of messages. So those kind of application qualify as basic. Medium is you have some complexities in terms of routing. Like routing means you navigate a user between multiple pages, you make a bunch of API calls, but still your code is not large enough. You're not writing something as big as Amazon, Flipkart, those kind of application. And advanced means your application is really vast, you have a ton of data, you have a ton of screens, You have a ton of session data or the state management which has to be done. So those kind of things are called as advanced, right? So once you select your app complexity, and the next thing it will ask is it will ask you to check a few options. So one is like I use ng upgrade to combine Angular JS and Angular. Most of the time this option is not required because people normally don't combine Angular JS and Angular in a single project. As I said, Angular JS is the first version which was released and was following a totally a different pattern, and Angular JS is the newest version using TypeScript. But there are a few legacy applications which might use a combination of these. But for most of the newer applications, this option is not available, so you can ignore this. Next is Angular Material. As I said, Angular Material is an extra library which is provided by Angular just for your styling requirements. So if you want to see Material, so you just go to a site called as material.angular.io, and over here there you have like this guides and components and CDKs. So if you click on component, so I will tell you what is the simple advantage of this. Like as we discussed earlier, say I know I need to implement something like this, I want to implement this drop down where I automatically get this list and I can select something or I want to show something like this, if you were to do it just by your HTML and CSS, it will take you a lot of time. But if you use Angular Material, all you need to do is just import this particular library into your application, and just by writing this code, your entire component would be ready, right? So don't worry, we'll be coming into that. But what this means is if you are using Angular Material, you need to check this. So whenever you upgrade your Angular version, so similarly even the Angular Material version will be upgraded. And if you use Windows, you can check this. If you're using a Mac or Linux, you don't need to check it. And once you click on show me how to update, automatically whatever commands you need to execute for your application to upgrade, those will be shown to you at the bottom. So over here, as you can see, it will tell you to first run this command, which is npx at the rate angular slash CLI at the rate 13 update at the rate angular slash core at the rate 13 and at the rate angular slash CLA at the rate 13, right? So what this is doing, let's try to understand. So when you run this command, first let's try to break it down. What is npx? So npx is nothing but it is just a npm command where you are temporarily installing this Angular CLI of, and at the rate 13 means you are installing specifically the version 13, right? So it will install this Angular CLI version 13 in your local wherever path you are running from. And after that, what it will do is in the current project, it will update the current Angular core and Angular CLI version to version 13. So this is what the first step that it does. The second step that you need to run is npx CLI 13 update Angular material to 13. So what this will do is any libraries which are any libraries which are used of Angular material, that also it will upgrade to the version 13. And after that, the Angular team also gives you some notes and tips or what you need to know. Say for example, when you upgrade from Angular 12 to 13, it says that it is using TypeScript version 4.4, and it will tell you that please refer to this typescriptlang.org which we saw earlier to just to understand if there are any breaking changes you need to do, right? So you can read through this, check it. And after that, it also tell you if there are any dependencies. So it will tell you that make sure you're using Node 12.2 or later when you're using Angular 13. So as you keep on doing each of these steps, you can check it just for your reference to know that you have done it or not done it. And yeah, and once you have completed it, it will tell you if there are any other things that also you need to do after the update. So if there are no other changes, it will just tell you that there are currently any changes required between these versions. As I told you, right, when you are just moving from to the next version, there won't be much of a change. But say if the same thing I do for say from Angular 8 to Angular 13, you would see that there's a bunch of commands that I need to run. And as I said, initially, first you would be jumping from Angular 8. In this case, I took Angular 8, right? So first thing is, first I need to go from Angular 8 to Angular 9. Then as you can see, then I will be jumping to Angular 10. Then I will be jumping to Angular 11, then to Angular 12, and finally to Angular 13. And once all these steps are completed, then only my entire application would be upgraded from Angular 8 to Angular 13. And also remember one more thing, if you're using a lot of third-party libraries in your application, there could be a bunch of other libraries or utilities which you could be using. So whenever you upgrade your version to the newest Angular version, always ensure that even those libraries are supporting the newest Angular version. So sometimes there could be possibilities that the library which you're using may not support the latest Angular version. So those kind of errors won't be shown over here because those are custom libraries. So you also need to ensure that any libraries which you install, and when you upgrade your Angular, those libraries also support and work fine as well. So I think we had enough of this history session. So with that, we conclude the second session for now, and I will see you guys in the next session. Thank you.